Almost everyone who has played Monopoly has owned the Reading Railroad. It sits on the board as a green rectangle between the cheapest properties and the best. A minor piece, a square that earns its owner a modest rent, and is generally forgotten by the third time around the board. For most of the 90 years since Parker Brothers began selling the game in the 1930s, it has functioned as filler. 2 words, a railroad image, $25 in rent when someone lands on it. What almost no one who has ever held that green card knows is that the Reading Railroad was a real corporation, headquartered in a real Pennsylvania city on the Schuylkill River, and that in 1871 it was, by capitalization, the largest corporation on earth, not a large railroad, not a prominent industrial company, the largest corporation in the world. The toy survived the empire that inspired it, and Reading, Pennsylvania kept almost nothing else. This is the story of how that happened. Chapter 1. The River. In 1748, Thomas Penn and Richard Penn, sons of William Penn, the Quaker proprietor, who had received the colony of Pennsylvania as a grant from the English crown, laid out a town on the east bank of the Schuylkill River and gave it a name that required nothing more than a glance at their own family history. They called it Reading, after the English town in Berkshire, from which their father's family had come. It became the seat of Berks County. German farmers and iron masters settled the surrounding land, drawn by the same thing that drew settlers to the Pennsylvania interior in that era: good soil, navigable water, and sufficient distance from Philadelphia to keep land prices within reach. The iron furnaces lit up the ridges. The farmland produced wheat and corn and rye. Reading was prosperous in the modest, durable way of a county seat, without a single defining industry, without a fortune, without a name that traveled farther than the next county over. That was before anyone understood what the river meant. The Schuylkill runs roughly southeast from the mountains of central Pennsylvania down through a series of narrow valleys before it widens and empties into the Delaware at Philadelphia. Reading sits at a particular point on that line. Not at random, not by accident of proprietary generosity, but at the precise location where the river valley forms its longest and most passable corridor between two things that the early 19th century would decide could not stay separated. To the north, in the steep ridges of Schuylkill and Carbon and Northumberland counties, lay the anthracite coal fields. To the south, 60 miles downriver, lay Philadelphia and the Atlantic trade. The geography of eastern Pennsylvania is not complicated. There was one convenient path between those mountains and that sea, and Reading was on it. Anthracite is not the coal of legend and disaster, not the soft bituminous that catches easily and burns black and dirty and fast. Anthracite is hard, dense, nearly pure carbon, and it burns clean and extremely hot with almost no smoke. It is difficult to ignite and unforgiving of poor draft, which is why it had languished in the Pennsylvania mountains for generations, known but largely unused, too hard to light for a farmhouse hearth, and too heavy to carry far when there was softer wood within reach. Then American cities began to industrialize. Then the furnaces and the foundries and the ironworks, and eventually the steam engines, required a fuel that burned reliably and burned long and did not fill the shop floor with soot. Anthracite was exactly that fuel. The mountains to the north of Reading held it in quantities that, as the 1820s approached, were beginning to look less like a regional curiosity and more like the energy supply of an entire civilization. The coal that had been almost worthless in the ground was about to become one of the most valuable commodities in America. Not in 50 years, not in a generation. Within a decade or two, the northeastern economy would reorganize itself around anthracite the way it had organized itself around water power and timber before. Fast, completely, with very little sentiment for what had come before. Every city that needed heat would need it. Every manufacturer that needed steady industrial flame would need it. Every household in Philadelphia and New York and Boston that wanted to stop burning wood in the winter would need it. The coal was in the mountains. The market was on the coast. Reading sat between them, at the only reasonable passage the river provided. It was geography as destiny, the kind of accident of location that a city either exploits or watches someone else exploit on its behalf. The Schuylkill River Valley between the coal fields and Philadelphia was, in the language of infrastructure, a natural corridor. Whatever moved that coal to market would have to move through it. Whatever moved through it would have to pass through Reading. The river had made the town. The coal would make everything else. Whatever fortune was coming had been there the whole time, waiting in the angle of the hills and the direction of the current. Chapter 2. Black Diamonds. The Schuylkill navigation opened in the 1820s, and Reading's position on the river ceased to be a geographic fact and became an economic one. The navigation was a system of canals and slackwater pools threading the Schuylkill Valley from the coal fields to Philadelphia. Not a grand engineering statement, not a monument to civic ambition, but a practical mechanism, a chain of locks and dug channels and impounded river reaches that allowed a boat loaded with coal to travel from the mountains to the sea without having to portage a single ridge. That was all it required. A path down the water, a path that passed through Reading. Before the canal, anthracite coal had been a curiosity in the mountains. Heavy, difficult to transport, stubborn to ignite, commercially worthless beyond the immediate valleys where it was dug. After the canal, it was something else entirely. Within years of the navigation opening, anthracite tonnage moving south along the Schuylkill began to climb in quantities that rewrote the arithmetic of every furnace owner and every coal merchant between Philadelphia and the Ridge. The fuel that Philadelphia's foundries had been unable to obtain reliably was suddenly available in volume. The households of the eastern seaboard that had burned wood against the winter began, steadily and then rapidly, to burn anthracite instead. The navigation had not created the demand. It had simply removed the obstacle that stood between the demand and the supply, and Reading sat at the midpoint of that removal. The location where coal barges paused, where merchants dealt, where money passed through hands on its way to becoming something more permanent. But canals have a natural ceiling. They freeze in winter and silt in drought. A mule-drawn barge on the Schuylkill carried coal at the pace of a walking animal. What chartered in 1833 was a different proposition entirely. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad received its charter that year with a purpose that left no ambiguity: haul coal faster, in greater volume, at lower cost, from the anthracite fields to Philadelphia. The main line from Philadelphia to Pottsville opened in 1842, threading the same Schuylkill corridor the canal had followed, but at a speed and capacity that made the canal look like a garden path. A locomotive on iron rails moved coal at a rate no barge master could match in a week. The railroad outpaced the canal. Then it eclipsed it. The navigation did not disappear overnight. It lingered for decades, carrying what commerce it could. But after 1842, the canal was a footnote to a story whose main characters moved on rails. The railroad chose Reading, the locomotive shops, the car repair facilities, the maintenance yards, the entire mechanical infrastructure that a railroad of this scale required to keep its equipment running, were built in the city itself, not distributed across the line, but concentrated here, on the flat land along the Schuylkill, where the workforce was available and the river provided water and the position on the main line made logistics manageable. Thousands of Reading men went to work in those shops. They built locomotives. They repaired freight cars. They machined parts and maintained track and kept the coal moving. The town that had been a county seat orderly, German, modest, sustained by wheat and iron and the ordinary commerce of a regional market, became something different, a company town, not in spirit. In the plain economic sense that the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad was now the dominant fact of life for a substantial portion of the city's working population, and its fortunes and readings had become the same fortune. The scale of what had happened requires a moment of accounting. Cheap coal transport rearranged the energy economy of the Northeast with a comprehensiveness that is difficult to overstate. It heated homes. It fired furnaces. It generated steam for the mills spreading across Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York. It freed the industrial economy from its dependency on wood and water power and gave it a fuel that could be stockpiled, shipped, and burned in volumes that wood could never have sustained. The railroad was the mechanism that made all of it possible at the speed and scale that the 1840s demanded, and Reading sat at the toll booth, the point through which the coal and the revenue had to pass on their way from the mountain to the market. The canal had made Reading relevant. The railroad made it indispensable. Chapter 3. Gowen. Franklin Benjamin. Gowen was born in Philadelphia in 1836 to an Irish Protestant merchant family of modest standing. He read law, passed the bar, and by his late 20s had established a reputation in the Pennsylvania coal districts for the kind of advocacy that wins cases by wearing down whatever stands in the way. He was physically imposing, eloquent in court, and constitutionally incapable of distinguishing between a problem and an enemy. In 1869, at 33 years old, he was appointed president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. He arrived at the company the way a man arrives who intends to leave a different organization than the one he found. Gowen's diagnosis of the railroad's structural weakness was immediate and correct. The Philadelphia and Reading did not merely carry coal. It depended on coal, which meant it depended on the coal operators who set prices, who could combine against it, who could strangle its revenues whenever it suited them. His solution was vertical integration on a scale that had no precedent in American industry. In 1871, he created the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company as a subsidiary, and through a sustained program of acquisition, buying collieries, leasing mines, absorbing operators who could not resist or could not compete, he secured for the railroad more than 40% of the nation's anthracite reserves. Not influence over the coal trade, not a substantial position in the coal trade. The coal trade itself, in its majority, now moved through a corporation that Gowen controlled. The dollar figure that resulted was, by any accounting, staggering. By 1871, the Philadelphia and Reading carried a gross capitalization of roughly $170 million, a figure that placed it beyond every other corporation then operating in the world. The largest corporation on earth was a railroad headquartered in a Pennsylvania city on the Schuylkill, and a lawyer from Philadelphia had built it in 2 years, not by invention, not by discovery, by consolidation, by legal maneuver, by absorbing into one corporate structure the geography of an entire industry. Gowen's empire required a labor force he could not buy the way he had bought the mines. The anthracite region north of Reading was organized in informal and then increasingly formal ways by Irish immigrant mine workers, men who had come from the same counties of Connaught and Munster as the famine waves of the 1840s, and had gone underground in Carbon and Schuylkill and Luzerne counties because the mines were hiring the way the mills were hiring, and there was nothing else. Among them, according to the coal operators and railroad men, was a secret society known as the Molly Maguires, a network of Irish Catholic mine workers accused of orchestrating murders, beatings, and sabotage against mine supervisors and company men. In 1873, Gowen hired a Pinkerton operative named James McParland to infiltrate the organization. McParland spent nearly 3 years underground in the coal towns, accumulating testimony. The trials began in 1875, and Gowen prosecuted them personally, appearing before the juries as a private attorney retained by the railroad. 20 men were convicted and sentenced to death. 10 of them were hanged on a single day in June 1877. The hangings were conducted across 2 counties simultaneously, in the county jails at Pottsville and Mauch Chunk, on a morning that the newspapers called Black Thursday. Gowen had done what he had set out to do. The organized resistance in the coal fields was broken. The mines went on producing. The wealth that all of this generated flowed south along the Schuylkill and into Reading with the regularity of water finding its level. Banks opened on Penn Street. Hotels went up around the railroad depot. Mansions appeared on the hills above the Schuylkill, built by the men who managed the shops, the coal accounts, the legal work, the financing. The railroad's locomotive works employed thousands. The foundries that served the railroad employed thousands more. Reading became, by the measure of any comparable city, one of the wealthiest industrial cities of its size in America, a city built on a corridor and a commodity and the particular ruthlessness of one man's ambition. Gowen died in December 1889, alone in a room at Wormley's Hotel in Washington, D.C. by his own hand. He was 53. The railroad he had built had already passed through receivership once and would do so twice more before the century ended. The coal was still in the ground. The empire he had assembled, mines, railroad, the 40% of the nation's anthracite that he had bent the law to control, was intact, indifferent to the fate of the man who had constructed it. Chapter 4. The Workshop. Consider what the city was producing. By 1900, Reading, Pennsylvania had more than 700 manufacturing businesses operating within its limits. Not 700 storefronts, not 700 offices, but 700 factories and workshops and production floors making physical things and shipping them out through the Reading's freight yards to the rest of America. The saying went that Reading made a little of everything and a great deal of some things. It was not a one-industry town, though coal and the railroad had seeded it all. The anthracite fortune had been the original capital. The locomotive shops had been the original workforce. And from those roots the city had grown into something more complicated and more durable than a single commodity could have sustained. It made hosiery. It made hardware. It made candy and specialty steel and the machinery that made the hosiery. It made, in a Japanese-style pagoda on the crest of Mount Penn that cost $50,000 to build, a monument to its own improbable confidence. The textile story begins with 2 men and a specific ambition. Around 1900, Ferdinand Thun and Henry Janssen, German immigrant technicians who had arrived in America carrying the precision training of the German industrial tradition, founded what would grow into the Wyomissing Industries Complex in the borough of Wyomissing, just across the city line from Reading. Thun was the engineer. Janssen was the financier. Together, they built 2 operations that would define American textiles for a generation. The Textile Machine Works became the world's largest manufacturer of full-fashioned hosiery machinery. The mechanical looms that produced stockings with the shaped heel and toe that American women considered the standard of quality. The Berkshire Knitting Mills, their companion enterprise, became America's largest producer of full-fashioned hosiery itself. Not a significant producer, the largest. Reading had become a capital of American textiles the way it had become a capital of coal transport, by controlling not just the product, but the machinery that made the product possible. Something else was happening on North 5th Street in 1879. A young man named William H. Loudon had begun making candy in a back room of his father's jewelry shop. Hard candies, confections, the sort of small commerce that did not yet suggest anything beyond a local trade. In 1881, he invented the menthol cough drop, a small amber-colored lozenge that combined menthol with a sweet base and offered relief to sore throats across a country that had not yet produced anything quite like it. Luden's cough drops shipped out of Reading for more than a century. The jewelry shop on North 5th Street was the origin of a brand that millions of Americans would encounter in drugstores from Maine to California without knowing the name of the Pennsylvania city that made them. That same year, 1889, a reading firm called Carpenter Steel was incorporated to manufacture specialty steel alloys for industrial and commercial use. Most of what Reading built in those decades would not survive the century. Carpenter Steel would. It endured through the collapses that emptied the city of nearly everything else, changing names along the way to Carpenter Technology, and it operates in Reading still. One of the few industrial concerns from the Gilded Age that outlasted the conditions that created it, without yet knowing, in 1889, how rare that distinction would become. In 1914, a Russian immigrant peddler named Solomon Boskov opened a dry goods store in Reading. He was selling from a pushcart when he arrived. The store he opened grew, and the stores it spawned grew further, until Boskov's became and has remained the largest family-owned department store chain in America. Hardware, hosiery, candy, specialty steel, dry goods, and the machinery to make the hosiery. Reading made them all. The railroad fortune had not simply built a city, it had capitalized an entire ecosystem of manufacture, and the ecosystem had taken on its own momentum. It made hundreds of different things. It shipped them everywhere. And for a moment, it looked as though the city could outlast any single industry that had built it. Saint Chapter 5. The Divine Right. In the summer of 1902, the anthracite miners of northeastern Pennsylvania walked off the job. They wanted shorter hours, better wages, and recognition for their union. What they got? In addition to a prolonged standoff that eventually drew the intervention of President Theodore Roosevelt, was a letter. George F. Baer was president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad by then. Not Gowen's successor in temperament exactly, but in position and in conviction, very much his heir. Baer was a lawyer and a churchman, and a man of settled views about the natural order of industrial life. When a well-meaning minister wrote to ask that Baer consider a compromise that would end the miners' suffering, Baer wrote back. His reply reached the newspapers almost immediately. The rights and interests of the laboring man, Baer wrote, will be protected and cared for, not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian men to whom God in his infinite wisdom has given control of the property interests of the country. The sentence ran in papers across the country. Baer had not meant it as a confession. He had meant it as a statement of fact, the plain articulation of an arrangement that he and the men around him understood to be the natural condition of industrial society, no more requiring defense than the angle of the hills or the direction of the Schuylkill current. God had given certain men control of the anthracite. Those men would decide, in their wisdom, what the miners deserved. The suggestion that anyone else had standing in the matter was, to Baer, not so much wrong as confused. The letter did not end the strike. It ended Baer's public reputation. Roosevelt, reading it at Oyster Bay, regarded it as a remarkable piece of arrogance from a man of business. But the letter's damage to Baer was beside the point. What it had done, inadvertently, in the way that truly revealing documents are always inadvertent, was give precise language to a conviction that the coal and railroad fortunes of the Schuylkill Valley had been operating on for 3 decades. Gowen had believed it. The men who built the mansions on the hills above Penn Street had believed it. Baer had simply written it down. The city, in those same years, was building monuments to its confidence. On the crest of Mount Penn, high above the rooftops of Reading, a 7-story tower in the style of a Japanese pagoda was completed in 1908. It was meant as the anchor of a luxury mountain resort, a destination development intended to draw the carriage trade up the slopes by cable car and hold them there among hotels and gardens, and the kind of constructed leisure that Gilded Age money had learned to consume. The resort was never finished. The investors who had assembled it could not make the numbers work, or lost interest, or found that a mountain above a coal and railroad city was not, in the end, the summer destination they had imagined. The tower stood alone on the crest. In 1911, the owners donated it to the city of Reading, and Reading accepted it and lit it. From that point forward, the pagoda burned on the mountain above the city every night, visible for miles, a point of red light on the dark ridge. Reading's answer to the question of what it looked like from a distance. By 1930, the question had an answer that required no metaphor. The census recorded 111,171 people inside the city limits. The highest count Reading would ever reach, the apex of a curve that had been climbing since the canal opened the Schuylkill and would never climb again. It was a railroad capital. It was a textile capital. It was the self-proclaimed pretzel capital of the world, a designation that arrived from the concentration of commercial pretzel bakeries that had grown out of the Pennsylvania Dutch baking tradition and made Reading, by some measures, the largest producer of the salted braid in America. A city that made full-fashioned hosiery and specialty steel and menthol cough drops and hard pretzels. A city that made hundreds of things and shipped them everywhere. A city whose railroad had once been the largest corporation on earth and whose factories had replaced the coal as the proof of its own indispensability. The pagoda burned on the mountain. The factories ran. The freight moved south along the Schuylkill to Philadelphia and out to the country beyond. Bear's letter had been laughed at in the newspapers, but the arrangement it described, God's infinite wisdom having given certain men control of the property interests of Reading, Pennsylvania, was still very much in force. The city at its peak had no reason to think otherwise. It was 1930, and the arrangement felt permanent. Chapter 6. The Quiet Pivot. And then, very quietly, the thing that had built the city began to lose its market. It did not happen on a specific date. There was no announcement, no crisis meeting, no single morning when the men in the freight offices along the Schuylkill looked at their ledgers and understood what was coming. Through the middle of the 20th century, American households stopped heating themselves with anthracite. Oil furnaces arrived in the suburbs. Natural gas lines threaded into the new developments spreading across the flatlands outside of every eastern city. The fuel was cleaner, easier, self-regulating, a thermostat dial instead of a stoker and a coal bin in the basement. Anthracite required attention. The new fuels did not. The preference was not complicated once the alternative existed. And by 1945, the alternative existed everywhere the American economy was building. The number that tells the story requires no elaboration. Anthracite tonnage carried by the Reading Railroad collapsed from 16 million tons in 1945 to under 2 million tons by 1975. 30 years. An 87% decline in the single commodity the entire structure had been built to move. Not a slowdown, not a correction, an erasure. The railroad had always been more fragile than it looked. The Philadelphia and Reading had been built for one purpose, to move hard coal from the mountains to the sea. And every branch, every yard, every freight classification shed along its length had been designed with that purpose in mind. What it had not been designed for was the absence of coal. Franklin Gowen had understood this in 1871, when he moved to control the mines directly, reasoning that a railroad dependent on a commodity it did not own was a railroad at the mercy of men who might someday route their coal another way. He had been right about the dependency. He had not imagined a world in which the commodity itself became unnecessary. The Philadelphia and Reading had passed through receivership 3 times before 1900, and each time it had survived because the coal was still there, still moving, still generating the revenues that made reorganization possible. That same coal was now disappearing. A railroad designed to haul a commodity the country was quietly designing out of its daily life had no equivalent recovery. The textile fortune unraveled on the same schedule, at the same unhurried pace, for reasons that followed their own logic. The full-fashioned hosiery that had made Reading a capital of American textiles, the shaped, seamless stockings that Berkshire knitting mills had produced in quantities that no other facility in America could match, was undone by nylon, not by competition within the industry, by the replacement of the industry's product. DuPont had introduced nylon hosiery in 1939, and by the late 1940s the synthetic fiber had transformed what American women expected of a stocking: lighter, stronger, cheaper, requiring none of the skilled mechanical precision that made the textile machine works indispensable. Automation took what nylon left. Cheaper mills took what automation left. Mills in the Carolinas, mills in Georgia, mills in the Piedmont South where wages were lower and union contracts were absent, and the economics of textile production had shifted irrevocably away from the Pennsylvania city that had once led the world in the machinery that made it possible. The great knitting mills that had employed thousands shrank and shut through the post-war years. Berkshire knitting mills contracted. Wyomissing Industries, the complex Ferdinand Thun, and Henry Janssen had built into a global textile machinery concern, lost the markets it had assumed were permanent. Nothing burned. Nothing failed in a single catastrophic quarter. The orders simply stopped coming, one category at a time, one contract at a time, across 2 decades of managed diminishment. This is not a catastrophe with a date. It is an erosion. The coal stopped mattering, slowly. The hosiery stopped selling, slowly. The railroad stopped running full cars, slowly. Everything built on the coal. The freight revenue, the shop employment, the textile machinery that the freight revenue had financed, the department stores and the pretzel bakeries, and the row hooms that the textile wages had sustained, lost its footing at the same unhurried pace. The city did not fall. It subsided. The pagoda still burned on the mountain. Below it, the arrangement that had felt permanent in 1930 was becoming, without drama and without announcement, something that would not survive the century. Chapter 7. Bankruptcy. The Reading Company filed for bankruptcy in 1971, not receivership. The familiar shelter the railroad had sought 3 times in the 19th century and survived each time because the coal was still moving and the revenues, however diminished, still existed. Bankruptcy. The end of the legal fiction that the organization could meet its obligations and continue. The coal that had built the railroad, the coal that had made it the largest corporation on earth a century earlier, had been moving in quantities insufficient to sustain the structure for years. Federal regulation had done the rest. A regulatory regime that denied railroads competitive pricing, imposed tax burdens that their trucking competitors did not carry, and required them to continue running passenger service that bled money on every trip. The math, by 1971, was not close. On April 1st, 1976, the Reading's rail lines were folded into the Consolidated Rail Corporation, Conrail. A federally created entity assembled from the wreckage of 6 bankrupt northeastern railroads that the market had finished and the government had decided to absorb rather than abandon. The railroad that had been, by capitalization, the largest corporation in the world, ceased to exist as an independent company on that date, and became instead a set of track miles, freight yards, and right-of-way absorbed into a federal salvage operation. Not a merger, not an acquisition, a salvage. The corporation Franklin Gowen had built in 2 years, by controlling 40% of the nation's anthracite, had been reduced in a century to a balance sheet problem that Congress solved by consolidation. The factories that had grown up in the railroad's shadow did not outlast it by much. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the plants closed, one category at a time, one announced closure at a time, each one framed as a response to market conditions that the city could not control and did not cause. The hosiery mills that had made Reading a textile capital were already gone. The hardware manufacturers went. The machinery works went. The specialty manufacturers that had filled the freight yards with outbound cars went. What stayed was the exception. Carpenter Technology, the specialty steel firm incorporated in 1889 and outlasting everything else the Gilded Age had built in Reading, kept running, kept making steel, an anomaly in a landscape of departure. For a time, something replaced the industry, or tried to. The emptied mills, the long brick buildings along the creek valleys, the former knitting halls and machinery floors, and factory complexes that the city's industrial boom had razed and the collapse had vacated, were converted into retail space. Reading remade itself as the outlet capital of the world, a designation it pursued with the energy of a city that understood it had to become something, that the emptied buildings required a use, that discount retail and former factory space was a model that worked, at least for a while. The converted mills filled with shoppers, looking for factory seconds, overstock, the goods that the American manufacturing economy produced in excess and needed to move somewhere. The building that had made something now sold what other buildings made elsewhere. It was not nothing. It was not a future. It was, in the bluntest possible terms, a city selling the past at a markdown. The infrastructure of industry, the brick, the square footage, the loading docks and the high ceilings and the railroad access, had been repurposed to serve an economy that required none of the things that had made Reading the place to build industry in the first place. Not the Schuylkill corridor, not the anthracite connection, not the skilled workforce that had trained on machines now obsolete. The outlet stores needed parking and highway access and a customer base willing to drive in from the suburbs. The corridor that had made Reading indispensable to the coal trade had nothing to do with it. The structures stayed standing. The brick buildings along the creek, the factory complexes, the converted mill spaces, they remained solid and square, looking much as they had when they were built, offering no visible evidence of the economic evacuation that had happened inside them. Walls do not record departure. A building that once housed 500 workers at knitting machines and now houses a discount clothing retailer looks, from the eye, outside, like a building that is in use. The machinery was gone. The jobs were gone. The wages that had sustained the row houses and the schools and the stores along Penn Street were gone. The buildings stood, as they had been built to stand, in a city that was quietly becoming something its builders had not planned for and could not have imagined. Chapter 8. The Poorest City. The population of Reading in 1930 was 111,171. The census taken in 1940 recorded 110,568. The census taken in 1950 recorded 109,320. Each count was smaller than the one before it, and at first the loss was small enough that a city could absorb it without noticing. A few thousand fewer people, a few hundred fewer jobs, the ordinary arithmetic of a post-war economy reshaping itself around the automobile and the suburb and the highway that led away. But the census taken in 1960 recorded 98,177. The census taken in 1970 recorded 87,643. The census taken in 1980 recorded 78,686. Each decade stripped another 10,000 people from a city that had been built for industry and was now, decade by decade, losing the industry and the people together, one following the other out through the same exits, the highway north, the highway south, The new subdivisions in Muhlenberg Township and Spring Township, and the flat farmland east of the Schuylkill, where land was cheap and the school districts had not yet been asked to absorb what Reading was becoming. What left first was the work, then the workers followed the work. Then the businesses that had served the workers followed the workers. The corner stores that had run on the wages of knitting mill employees closed when the employees were gone. The savings and loan associations that had held the mortgages on the row houses held collateral that was declining in value faster than the mortgages were being paid down. The contractors who had maintained the factory buildings, the boilermen, the electricians, the machine repairmen, followed the contracts out of the city. A city is not a single organism, but it operates like one. And when the central function fails, the whole system reorganizes around the failure. The retail followed the residential. The residential followed the industrial. The industrial had followed the coal. The row houses stayed. Reading had built itself in brick during the long industrial decades, and brick does not leave. The streets of 2- and 3-story row houses that the railroad workers and textile workers and factory hands had occupied from the 1880s onward were still standing in the 1970s and the 1980s and after, solid, dense, close to the street, built for families whose incomes came from the locomotive shops and the knitting floors and the hardware works, and who had no reason when those houses were built to imagine any of those things going away. The houses remained available, and they were cheap because they were in a city that the middle class had decided to leave. The people who moved in were people for whom cheap was the condition, not the warning. By 2000, the Census Bureau counted 81,207 people inside Reading's city limits. By 2010, that number had risen to 88,082, a small reversal that reflected new arrivals more than recovery. A Latino community of Puerto Rican and Dominican heritage, moving into the brick row houses the industrial workers had vacated, drawn by the same arithmetic that had always drawn working people to the industrial city: rent that was low, space that was available, and proximity to whatever employment remained. But the employment that remained was not the employment the city had been built around, and the poverty rate, the share of residents living below the federal poverty line, had been climbing through those same decades with the same unhurried persistence as the population had been falling. Not a crisis, a long withdrawal. In 2011, the Census Bureau published its findings from the American Community Survey and reported that Reading, Pennsylvania, had a poverty rate above 41%. The highest recorded poverty rate of any city in the United States. Not the highest in Pennsylvania, not the highest in the Northeast, the highest in the country, among cities of over 65,000 people. A decade earlier, Reading had ranked 32nd on the same measure, the 32nd poorest city in America. In a single decade, it had fallen from 32nd to 1st. The speed of it was worth a moment of attention, not a generation, not the slow subsidence of the coal and the textile and the railroad years, the long erosion that had taken 40 years to hollow the industrial base, 10 years from 32nd to last. The city that had stood at the center of the anthracite trade, that had been headquarters to the largest corporation on earth in 1871, that had employed thousands in its locomotive shops and its knitting mills and its specialty steel works and its hardware factories. That city now had more than 4 in 10 of its residents living below the poverty line. The row houses built for industrial wages housed families with no industry to work in. The brick that had been meant to last was lasting. The conditions it had been built to contain were gone. The largest corporation on earth, the poorest city in America. The two facts sit in the ledger 140 years apart, recorded by the same kind of counting, one by capitalization, one by the Census Bureau, with the same flat precision that numbers have when they are not trying to persuade you of anything. They are simply what the counting found. Chapter 9. What Remains? The city that emptied did not vanish. It was repopulated. Through the 1980s and 1990s and into the new century, a large Latino community, much of it of Puerto Rican and Dominican heritage, moved into the brick row houses the railroad workers and hosiery workers and hardware men had left behind. The rent was low. The buildings were solid. The arithmetic was the same arithmetic that had always drawn working people to Reading, Pennsylvania. Space was available, and the price was within reach. Today, the city holds about 95,000 people, roughly two-thirds of them Hispanic. It is one of the most Latino cities in the Northeast. This is not a recovery in the industrial sense. It is a population. It is a city inhabited, going about its life in the structures another city built and left behind. The monuments of the boom still stand. Carpenter technology, incorporated as Carpenter steel in 1889, in the same year that Franklin Gowen died alone in a Washington hotel room, still makes specialty steel in Reading, one of the few industrial concerns from the Gilded Age that outlasted the conditions that created it. Boscov's, the department store that Solomon Boscov started from a pushcart in 1914, still anchors the region's retail trade, the largest family-owned department store chain in America operating from the city where it began. A former safety goggle works near the city center has been converted into an arts facility. The building that once made the lenses that protected industrial eyes now houses studios and galleries. The factory floor given over to what factories are given over to when the factories are gone. The brick is the same brick. The ceilings are the same ceilings. The walls do not record departure. And the name survives. It survives in a place its makers never imagined, on a cardboard square, between the cheapest properties and the best, on a board game that Parker Brothers began selling in the 1930s. The Reading Railroad is one of the 4 railroads on the American Monopoly Board. It has been owned, in the casual way of a game piece, by millions of people who have never heard of the city on the Schuylkill, who have never driven the highway through Berks County, who have no idea that the green rectangle in their hand was once the name of the largest corporation on earth. The corporation that Franklin Gowen assembled in 2 years, 40% of the nation's anthracite, $170 million in capitalization, the largest enterprise in the world, by any measure that mattered in 1871, is now a square on a board game, a souvenir. A piece of cardboard that earns its owner a modest rent and is generally forgotten by the 3rd time around the board. The coal is gone. The great mills are quiet. The hosiery and the locomotives and the roar of the freight yards are memories held now only by the archives and the oldest residents of a city that has been something else for longer than it was what it was built to be. Stand on Mount Penn at night, and the pagoda is lit above the valley. A point of red light on the dark ridge, 7 stories of Japanese-style timber and tile burning on the crest the way it has burned since 1911, when the owners of an unfinished resort decided the mountain was not worth keeping and gave the tower to the city, and the city turned on the lights. The rails below carry almost nothing of what they once carried. The Schuylkill moves through the valley the way it has always moved, toward Philadelphia, toward the sea, indifferent to the argument about what it meant. The row houses run in their dense brick lines down the slopes. The city is there, inhabited, breathing, something other than what the men who built it intended. The red light burns on the mountain, visible for miles, the way it has been since the city first switched it on. It was never meant to be the thing that lasted. It was the ornament on a resort that was never built, the least practical thing the boom ever raised, and it outlived the coal, the railroad, the mills, and the fortune that made all of them possible. The freight is gone. The pagoda is still lit,